All right, let me set the scene. Picture this. I'm 41, doing pretty well for myself. High up in a government office. And no, not just some pencil pusher. I'm talking about a pretty cushy gig. The kind of job that brings respect, connections, and yet the good salary, enough to never worry about bills, vacations, or the new car smell. Life's comfortable. Actually, more than comfortable, it's abundant. There's something about that stability. You walk into work each day, knowing your decisions carry weight. You're not just shuffling papers. You're moving pieces on a larger board. It's an ego boost, no doubt. People see you differently. But behind the suits, the polished shoes, and the carefully worded memos, you start feeling a bit robotic. Almost like the prestige and the paycheck are the only things left propping you up. Enter Claire, my wife. She's 35, and yeah, she's younger than me, but she's got this effortless charm. Not in that overly flashy way, but more like an understated elegance that you'd expect from someone who works with art for a living. She's an art consultant. Sounds fancy, right? Well, it kind of is. She spends her days talking about paintings I'll never understand, with collectors and artists who live in a world that feels galaxies away from my own. She's got an eye for aesthetics, an ability to find beauty where most of us just see splashes of paint. Our lifestyle? It's a routine of luxury disguised as normalcy. Breakfast is fresh ground coffee from beans we picked up on some fancy trip to Italy, and eggs, organic, free-range, probably from chickens that do yoga or something. Claire likes to keep things high-end, but subtle, like her taste in wine. She'll uncork some obscure bottle she discovered at a gallery opening. And while I nod along, pretending to taste all the floral notes and whatever nonsense is printed on the label, I'm really just thinking it's a decent buzz. We live in a place that's somewhere between modern and cozy, with just enough art on the walls to remind you Claire's got taste, but not so much that it feels like a museum. Big windows, natural light, and enough space for us to not get in each other's way. The kind of home where everything is in its place, but not because someone's checking, just because it's how we've gotten used to living. We got a housekeeper who comes in 3 times a week, but Claire calls her a house manager, because apparently, housekeeper doesn't do her justice. Whatever works for me. Weekends? Well, Claire's usually off at some gallery or sipping wine with clients, and I'm either playing golf with colleagues or doing a leisurely drive in the new car, because when you've got money, there's always a new car. We've been to every high-end restaurant in town at least twice, and we travel a lot. Paris, Tokyo, Cape Town, you name it, we've probably been there, stayed in some 5-star hotel, and Instagrammed the hell out of it. While Claire does, I just end up in the photos. But despite all this, it's not always as picture-perfect as it seems. The whole abundant life starts to feel like a bubble after a while. Like we got everything but also nothing. Claire's always busy with work, flirting with the art world, mingling with people who have way more money than either of us, and talking about pieces that sell for 6 figures. And me? I'm deep into my own world. We pass each other like strangers sometimes in our big, beautiful house with everything we need, but nothing we seem to want from each other. There's this weird gap growing, you know? Claire's surrounded by passion every day, artists, collectors, this whole world of creativity that makes my government job look pretty gray. And I'm not gonna lie, after a while, you start looking around, wondering if there's more. More to feel, more to want. We moved into the new place about a year ago, bigger, shinier, the kind of house that screams, we've made it without being obnoxious about it. It's all sleek lines, glass, and stone, with a view that stretches out over the city like a postcard. High ceilings, an open floor plan, and a kitchen Claire is obsessed with, though we probably use the espresso machine more than the oven. There's a pool in the backyard, not Olympic-sized or anything, but enough to float around in with a cocktail on summer evenings. The whole thing feels like a magazine spread, but without the pressure to keep it pristine, thanks to our house manager. The neighborhood? It's one of those gated communities where everyone waves, but no one really knows each other's names. Most of the houses are just as polished as ours, but everyone's pretty low-key. You've got the usual mix, families with kids, retirees spending their time golfing, and the occasional couple like us, who seem to be more interested in their careers than anything else. It's quiet, clean, and safe. The lawns are all perfectly manicured, not because of some HOA rule, but because, well, people here can afford to keep things tidy. Then there's Mr. Harrison. He's 65, lives just a couple of houses down, and is the kind of man you immediately respect. He's retired now, but made his fortune in real estate. One of those quiet millionaires who never needs to show it off because his house, his life, already says it all. His place? Impeccable. It's got that old money feel to it, with a mix of timeless elegance and some serious luxury. The kind of home where you feel like you should speak softly and not touch anything unless invited to. But Mr. Harrison? He's the opposite of intimidating. We hit it off pretty quickly. He's got this calm, almost fatherly vibe, and we'd exchange pleasantries while walking around the neighborhood. Occasionally, we'd meet for coffee or a drink, talking about everything from local politics to life in general. He's got a wealth of stories and this easygoing way about him that makes you feel like time slows down a bit when you're around him. There's no rush in his world, just the quiet satisfaction of having lived a good, full life. What really brought us closer, though, was Claire. Mr. Harrison had just remodeled part of his home, and naturally, with his taste in money, it was stunning. But he needed help with the final touches, art, decor, all the stuff that can make or break a room. That's where Claire came in. He'd heard about her work in the art world, and one day, he casually asked if she'd be willing to lend her expertise. Claire was thrilled. It's not every day you get to work with someone who has both the taste and the budget to really make something special. She started spending more time over at his place, advising him on which pieces to invest in, how to arrange the art, and what kind of vibe each room should give off. It became a bit of a project for her, and Mr. Harrison seemed to enjoy the company. He wasn't pushy about it, just genuinely interested in what Claire had to offer. Sometimes, I'd catch them chatting over a glass of wine, discussing different styles, or the latest gallery opening. There was nothing weird about it. He's way older, after all, and he treated Claire with respect. But I'll admit, there was this slight pang of something, maybe jealousy, maybe just the realization that she was getting closer to someone, sharing her passion with him in a way we hadn't done in a while. But hey, the guy's a class act, and I couldn't exactly complain. Besides, he always made sure to include me whenever we talked, never crossing any lines. So now, Mr. Harrison's house is filled with Claire's influence. Elegant pieces, carefully selected to match the mood of each room. It's beautiful, of course, and our relationship with him? Still solid. He's the kind of neighbor everyone wants. Friendly, rich but not flashy, and genuinely good-hearted. August 15th. Yeah, that day sticks out like a sore thumb in my memory. It was one of those late summer afternoons, just hot enough to make you want to stay inside with the AC cranked up, but Claire had been over at Mr. Harrison's house again, helping him finish up some final touches on his art collection. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? She'd been working with him for weeks at that point, and everything seemed routine. But when she came back that evening, something was off. Way off. I noticed it the second she walked through the door. Usually, after she'd come back from one of those sessions, she was relaxed, maybe a little chatty, going on about the latest painting they'd placed or some art world gossip she'd picked up. But that day, she was jumpy, like her nerves were frayed. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter, missed the hook where she usually hangs it, and muttered under her breath, something Claire never does. I asked her, casually, "Hey, how was it at Harrison's? You guys finally wrapped things up over there?" I was expecting the usual, maybe a story about some quirky artist or how she convinced Mr. Harrison to splurge on another expensive piece. But she just shot me this distracted smile, tight-lipped like she was trying to keep something from spilling out, and said, "Yeah, it was fine. Just a long day." But I could tell it wasn't fine. Not at all. She kept fidgeting with her hands, wringing them together like she was trying to burn off some nervous energy. She was pacing too, moving from the kitchen to the living room and back again, like she didn't know where to settle herself. It was the kind of nervousness that practically filled the room, like whatever was going on inside her head was spilling out and she was trying and failing to contain it. I let it go for a while, figuring maybe it was just a bad day, but as the evening went on, it didn't get better. She barely touched her dinner, and Claire's usually the kind of person who enjoys food. When we sat down to watch something on TV, she didn't even pretend to be interested. Her phone kept buzzing, and every time it did, she'd glance at it, quickly flip it over, and set it down again, looking more agitated each time. Finally, I couldn't stand attention anymore. "Claire, what's going on? You've been acting weird since you got home. Did something happen at Harrison's?" She froze for a second, like a deer caught in headlights. Then she shook her head too quickly and said, "No, nothing happened. I'm just tired." But her voice wavered, and I could see her eyes darting, not meeting mine. It was obvious something had happened, but whatever it was, she wasn't about to share it. "Claire," I pressed, trying to keep my voice calm, "you're not acting like yourself. Just tell me what's going on. Did something happen with Harrison?" At that, her face softened, like she wanted to tell me, like she was on the edge of spilling everything. But instead, she just shook her head again and said, "It's nothing. Really, I'll be fine." But she didn't look fine. She looked rattled, like whatever happened at Mr. Harrison's house had gotten under her skin in a big way. I didn't push her after that. I figured maybe she'd talk about it when she was ready, but she never did. And honestly, I didn't know what to make of it. My mind ran through every possible scenario. Maybe Harrison had said something inappropriate. Maybe they'd had some kind of argument. Maybe something in that house had just set her off. But cheating? No, it didn't feel like that. This was different, like whatever it was, it had shaken her, but wasn't something as obvious as an affair. That night, she barely slept. I could feel her tossing and turning next to me, and when I finally asked her if she was okay, she just mumbled, "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," and rolled over. Whatever had happened, it wasn't going away. For the next few days, the tension hung in the air. She was quieter than usual, more distant. Every time I asked if she was all right, she brushed it off, saying she was fine, just stressed. But I knew better. Something had happened at Mr. Harrison's that day, something that shook her up, but for some reason, she couldn't, or wouldn't, tell me what it was. And the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. What could have happened over there? What would get her so worked up that she couldn't even talk about it? A few days after that tense evening with Claire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I mean, the way she had come home, all rattled and nervous, and then wouldn't say a word about it. It was gnawing at me. I thought maybe she needed time to work through it herself, but I couldn't get that moment out of my head. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands and talk to Mr. Harrison directly. I figured I'd keep it casual, nothing too confrontational. After all, he'd always been a stand-up guy, and we had a decent relationship. I wasn't about to accuse him of anything. I just needed to know what went down that day because Claire clearly wasn't going to fill me in. I caught him in the morning, a few days later, when I saw him out in his front yard. He was pruning some bushes, looking as calm and collected as ever. I walked over, pretending I was just out for a stroll, and made some small talk about the weather and the neighborhood, just to ease into it. He greeted me with that same warm smile, but there was this moment, this flicker of something, when I mentioned Claire's last visit. "So, Claire's been a bit stressed lately," I said, keeping my tone light. "She came home the other day looking, well, a little shaken. Said you two have been working on the final touches of your design project. Everything go all right over there?" For the briefest second, I saw it, a flash of something across his face. It was subtle, but it was there. His smile faltered, and his eyes darted to the side before he composed himself. He laughed a little too quickly and said, "Oh yes, everything's fine. There was just a bit of a hiccup with one of the paintings we were setting up. One of those larger pieces by a popular artist, finicky thing to get mounted properly. But we sorted it out. All good now." His tone was steady, but that moment of hesitation, that flicker of fear, or maybe guilt, caught me off guard. I mean, I wasn't expecting anything dramatic, but that tiny crack in his usually calm demeanor made me pause. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it really was just a stressful day for them. I mean, Claire takes her work seriously, and getting art set up in a home like Mr. Harrison's is no small task. "Glad to hear it," I said, trying to shake off my own doubt. She seemed a little more worked up than usual, but I guess that happens sometimes when things don't go smoothly. Mr. Harrison nodded, a little too eagerly. "Absolutely. You know how Claire is perfectionist. It's understandable she'd be a bit tense when something doesn't go as planned. But really, everything's fine now. We wrapped up the design, and I couldn't be happier with how it all turned out." I could feel the unease simmering beneath his words. He was trying hard to reassure me, but there was still that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. What had made him hesitate? What had caused that flash of fear when I first brought up Claire? But in the end, he'd given me an explanation, a logical one, and maybe I was just reading too much into it. Maybe Claire really was just stressed about the project, and Mr. Harrison was caught off guard by me bringing it up. After all, it's not like he'd ever given me a reason not to trust him. So, I let it go for the moment. I told myself everything was fine. Claire was probably just having a rough day, and Mr. Harrison's slight nervousness was just him being polite, not wanting to get dragged into a domestic issue. I even thanked him for letting Claire help with his place, figuring I was being paranoid. But as I walked away, something still didn't sit right. That flicker, that brief moment of fear, it stuck with me. I calmed myself down, told myself that everything was okay. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than either of them were telling me. The week after my little talk with Mr. Harrison, things went back to normal, or at least they seemed to. Claire didn't bring up Harrison or the design project again, and as far as I could tell, she wasn't heading over there anymore. Whatever had happened, she seemed to have moved on, and eventually so did I. That strange nervousness she'd had on August 15th just kind of faded away, like a bad dream you can't fully remember the details of. Life settled back into its usual rhythm. Claire was back to her old self, throwing herself into work, getting caught up with other clients and art shows. There were no more weird silences at dinner, no more nervous fidgeting with her phone. She seemed lighter, like whatever had been bothering her had resolved itself. And honestly, that was good enough for me. I was tired of overthinking it, and things between us felt normal again. Comfortable. We got back into our routine of hosting barbecues with the neighbors. It was something we'd started doing not long after we moved in, just a casual way to stay connected with the community. Once every few weekends, we'd fire up the grill, invite a few people over, and spend the evening eating, drinking, and swapping stories. The kind of laid-back, suburban fun you get used to when you're living in a place like this. Mr. Harrison would come by sometimes, too. He was always the life of the party in his quiet, understated way. You know the type. The guy who doesn't have to try too hard to be liked. He'd show up with a bottle of expensive wine, dressed casual, but always just a little sharper than everyone else, and ease into conversations with that smooth charm of his. If there was any tension left over from that awkward moment a week earlier, it was gone. He and Claire were friendly, but not overly so. They'd talk about art, of course, but there was no sign of anything strange between them. In fact, it almost felt like whatever had happened on that last day at his house had put some distance between them in a good way. Claire seemed more focused on other things, and Harrison didn't bring up the project or ask for help anymore. As for me, I started to forget about that nervous moment altogether. Life felt good again. We had money, comfort, and a steady rhythm to our days. Barbecue weekends became a highlight, just good food, good people, and an occasional round of bad jokes with the neighbors. Harrison, as always, fit right in like the cool older guy who never overstayed his welcome, but was always fun to have around. The more time passed, the more that weird August 15th moment faded into the background, like it had never happened at all. Life had returned to its easy, predictable self, and for a while, I was happy to let it stay that way. No drama, no tension, just the comfortable life we'd built. It felt good, really good. And then, like it always does, life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. But at that point, everything seemed fine. Better than fine. I had almost forgotten that moment of doubt entirely. For a while, everything seemed like it had fallen back into place. The barbecues worked the routine. It was all familiar, comfortable. But then I started noticing little things. You know, the kind of stuff that sneaks up on you, subtle at first, but once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. It began with Claire's new obsession with yoga. Now, Claire had always been into fitness, so it didn't strike me as odd at first. She'd switch up her workouts every now and then, Pilates, spin classes, whatever was trending. But this new yoga class? It was different. It started off innocent enough, just something new she wanted to try. Once a week, every Tuesday, she'd head off to this new studio on the other side of town. She seemed excited about it at first, and I didn't think much of it. But then, after a few weeks, I noticed something strange. Every time she came back from these yoga classes, she wasn't her usual post-workout self. Normally, she'd come home feeling energized, maybe a little tired, but in a good way. Instead, she came back looking off, depressed almost. Her mood would just plummet, and she'd sit on the couch, staring blankly at the TV or scrolling through her phone without really engaging. At first, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. People have bad days, right? Maybe the class wasn't what she expected, or maybe she was just stressed out from work. But the more it happened, the more I noticed that her mood wasn't just a one-off thing. Every week, after that class, she'd come home looking like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. And it wasn't just the yoga. She'd been quieter in general, more distant, like she was stuck inside her own head. And no matter how much I tried to reach her, she was locked up tight. I tried to talk to her about it. A few times, actually. Hey, Claire, I'd say as casually as I could. You all right? You don't seem like yourself after these yoga classes. Is something bothering you? And every time, she'd brush it off. She'd force a smile, wave her hand like it was nothing, and say, "Oh, it's just, I don't know. I think I'm just tired. The class is a bit more intense than I expected." But it wasn't just tiredness. It was something deeper, something darker. Her responses were too quick, too dismissive, and her eyes would flicker with something that looked a lot like guilt. I tried again, this time a little more direct. Claire, seriously, what's going on? You're coming back from these classes looking miserable. If it's not working for you, maybe try something else? She didn't look at me when she answered, just stared down at her hands and said, "No, it's fine. I just need to stick with it. It'll get better." But it didn't. In fact, it got worse. Every week, it was the same story. She'd leave for yoga, come back looking like she'd just lost a battle with herself, and then withdraw into this strange, distant mood. It wasn't just sadness, though. There was guilt there too, like whatever was weighing her down wasn't just emotional. It was personal. I started to wonder if maybe it wasn't the yoga class at all. Maybe something was happening there, or someone. Maybe this wasn't just about exercise or stress. It felt like something more, something she didn't want to talk about. But every time I brought it up, it went nowhere. She'd shut me down with those quick reassurances, never giving me anything real to hold on to. "It's fine," she'd say, or "I'm just in a weird headspace lately." But it was obvious she wasn't being honest. Not with me, and probably not with herself either. The whole thing started to feel like one of those bells you hear in the back of your mind. Something's wrong, something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to a phase or stress, or some kind of burnout. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Claire wasn't herself, and whatever was going on, she wasn't letting me in. And the more I noticed, the more it gnawed at me. What was really happening at those yoga classes? And why? Every week, did she come back looking like she was carrying some kind of guilt she couldn't shake? I didn't have answers, but the questions were starting to pile up. By the time the next Tuesday rolled around, I'd had enough of sitting around and wondering what the hell was going on. The changes in Claire's behavior, the guilt, the way she came back from these so-called yoga classes, it was eating away at me. I had to know what was really happening. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I decided to follow her. I waited until she left the house, yoga mat tucked under her arm like always, dressed in her usual workout gear. I kept my distance as I tailed her, feeling a strange mix of adrenaline and dread coursing through me. It was one of those moments where you're hoping you're wrong, but already bracing for the worst. I told myself this could all just be some misunderstanding. Maybe she was going somewhere else before class. Maybe she needed space to think, to clear her head. But as I followed her, she didn't head toward the yoga studio. Instead, she drove in the opposite direction, toward a neighboring area. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just a quick detour. Something wasn't right. She pulled into a quiet street lined with beautiful houses, not unlike the one we lived in. They were large, upscale, with meticulously kept lawns and that polished, picture-perfect feel that comes with money. Claire parked outside one of these houses, one that looked eerily familiar, though I couldn't quite place why at first. I watched from a distance, heart pounding, as she got out of the car, her yoga mat forgotten in the back seat. She approached the front door with a sense of purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going. No hesitation, no looking back. I could barely breathe as I watched her knock on the door. The door opened and someone let her in. I couldn't see who it was from where I sat, but she slipped inside without a word. And just like that, she was gone. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, staring at the house in disbelief. Why would she come here? Who lived in this place? My mind was racing with possibilities, but one thing became clear. This wasn't a yoga class, and Claire wasn't meeting some group of women to stretch and meditate. After a while, I forced myself to drive away, telling myself I needed to keep calm to figure out what was really going on. I couldn't confront her without more information. I needed to know whose house this was and why she was going there week after week. As I drove back home, the pieces started to click together. The house, it was eerily similar to someone's, almost like a copy of a place I'd already been. That's when the guess hit me, hard and fast. I had one person in mind, and the thought made my stomach drop. I had a pretty good idea whose house that might be. The next weekend rolled around, and we hosted another one of our regular barbecues. As usual, the smell of grilled burgers and steaks filled the backyard, and the neighbors gathered, drinks in hand, sharing stories and laughs like everything was completely normal. But for me, it wasn't normal. Not after what I'd seen. I kept playing it cool, though, hiding my suspicions under a mask of casual conversation and friendly smiles. I wasn't ready to let anyone know what was brewing in my mind. We all gathered around the grill, beers in hand, the guys talking about the usual stuff, work, sports, and inevitably kids. Everyone had stories about their children, and the conversation drifted that way like it always did. Dan, from two houses down, started off chuckling about how his teenage daughter was already driving him crazy with her constant Snapchatting and TikTok dances. She's glued to that phone, like it's an extension of her hand. Can't get her to have a conversation without her texting someone mid-sentence. Mike, the guy who lived across the street, chimed in talking about his son's Little League baseball games. He's got a decent arm, but man, he's all over the place. One minute he's focused, the next he's chasing butterflies in the outfield. Gonna be a long season. Everyone laughed, and I nodded along, pretending like I was completely invested in the conversation. But all the while, my mind was on Claire and what she was doing in that house. It was eating me up inside, but I wasn't about to let it show. Then Mr. Harrison, standing just to my right, spoke up. He was quiet for a second, then sighed before mentioning his son. My son, David, he's 23 now. To be honest, we haven't had the best relationship. He's, well, a bit of a problem child. He paused, taking a long sip of his beer. He's never really gotten his life together, always jumping from one thing to the next. I tried to help him out, even gave him a house in the neighboring area, just to give him some space and hopefully some responsibility. But, well, you know how it is. That made my ears perk up. A house in the neighboring area? Suddenly, everything clicked into place. My guess had been right. That house Claire had been sneaking off to, it wasn't just any house. It belonged to David, Mr. Harrison's son. I kept my face neutral, swallowing the shock that was trying to claw its way up my throat. I didn't know you had a son, I said, trying to sound casual. So he's living close by? Harrison nodded, with a touch of frustration in his voice. Yeah, just a few streets over. The house is practically a replica of mine. Figured it'd be something he couldn't screw up too badly. But we don't talk much these days. He's got his own life, or whatever version of it he's trying to figure out. I forced a laugh, the whole time my mind's spinning. Claire hadn't been going to yoga at all. She'd been going to David's house. The question now was why. But I kept my cool, joining in the conversation like nothing was wrong, all the while knowing that this new piece of information had just blown everything wide open. The day after the barbecue party, everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. I'd spent most of the night tossing and turning, my mind replaying the conversation by the grill, trying to make sense of it all. Claire had been going to David's house, Mr. Harrison's son. That much was clear now. But the real question, the one I hadn't wanted to fully confront, was why. I didn't have to wait long for the truth to come out. The next day, I walked into the living room and saw Claire sitting on the couch, her phone in hand, typing away quickly. She didn't notice me at first, so I watched her for a moment, my heart pounding. Something about the way she was hunched over the screen felt secretive, suspicious. "Who are you texting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She jumped a little, startled, and then quickly locked the phone, her expression too neutral, too calm. "Oh, just a friend from yoga," she said with a slight smile, but I could see her fingers were still tense, holding the phone a little too tightly. "We were just talking about the class next week." I nodded, but my stomach twisted in knots. I knew she was lying. Everything in her body language screamed it. But I didn't push her, not yet. I just nodded again, pretending to believe her, and sat down on the other side of the couch. She didn't say much after that, and after a few minutes, she got up to take a shower. I watched as she left the room, her phone still sitting on the couch where she'd been. She never left her phone lying around like that. My pulse raced as I stared at it, the small device suddenly feeling like it held all the answers. For a second, I hesitated. I knew what I was about to do would break something between us, maybe for good. But then again, hadn't she already done that? Before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed the phone, unlocking it with ease. After all, I knew her passcode. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through her recent messages, and when I saw the name David at the top of the list, my heart nearly stopped. I opened the thread, and the first message that popped up hit me like a sledgehammer. "David, I can't stop thinking about how your mouth felt on me last time. I need to feel that again." I stared at the words, my stomach twisting into knots, disbelief washing over me like a cold wave. But it got worse, much worse. "Claire, God, I want you to. I can't wait until next time. I want you to come inside me again, David. I need it. I want you to make me pregnant." I sat there, frozen, barely able to breathe as I kept reading. "David, you're so bad. What if he finds out? You really want to risk it? Claire, I don't care. I'll do anything for you. It drives me crazy knowing you're close by, and we have to sneak around. I want it all with you. The messages were filled with graphic, intimate details. Messages about the last time they were together, about how David had pulled her into his arms as soon as she walked into his house, how she'd barely made it through the door before they were tearing at each other's clothes. Claire described every detail, and he responded with just as much enthusiasm. David, next time, no rushing. I want to take my time with you. Feel every inch of you. Claire, please, I want that too. I think about it all the time. When I'm with him, all I can think about is you. I felt sick. My entire body was shaking as I scrolled through the messages. The casual way they talked about me, about their little rendezvous, made it all the more unbearable. They had been meeting for weeks, maybe months, and every Tuesday yoga class was really just another excuse to be with him. And then there was again the line that sent chills down my spine. Claire, I mean it, David. I want you to get me pregnant. I want to have your baby. The phone nearly slipped from my hands as the reality of what I was seeing hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just an affair. Claire was ready to blow our entire life apart for this guy. David, a 23-year-old problem child who couldn't even maintain a relationship with his own father. I put the phone down, my mind racing. The truth had become painfully, disgustingly clear. There was no turning back from this. I sat there in stunned silence, my world unraveling piece by piece, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The bird was almost in the cage, and now I had to decide what to do with it. The next day felt like it dragged on forever. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't think straight. All I could do was replay those messages in my head over and over again. I knew what I had to do. There was no more wondering, no more doubting. The plan was set. When Claire left for her yoga class that evening, I was going to follow her, and this time, I wasn't just watching from a distance. I was going in. Tuesday rolled around, and sure enough, right on schedule, Claire grabbed her yoga mat, kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong, and headed out the door. I followed her again, keeping a safe distance, my heart pounding in my chest as I tailed her to David's house, the same one she'd been sneaking into for weeks. She parked, glanced around nervously like she always did, then walked up to the door. Before I could think too much, before I could second-guess myself, I parked and got out of the car, my blood boiling with every step I took toward the house. I watched as the door opened, David standing there, smirking, letting her in without a second thought. That smug look on his face, it pushed me right over the edge. I waited a few seconds, then stormed up the driveway, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Without knocking, I pushed the door open, stepping into the house like a man on a mission. There they were, standing in the living room, both of them startled, like they hadn't expected their little secret to blow up today. What the hell is going on here? My voice came out low and dangerous, shaking with barely contained rage. Claire's face went white, and David took a step back, his cocky expression faltering. Look, man, David started, but I cut him off. Shut up. I snapped, my fist clenched. I could feel the rage building inside me, ready to explode. You've been sneaking around with my wife in this house, and you think you could just stand there like it's nothing? Claire stammered. It's not what you think. Oh, it's exactly what I think, I said, my voice rising. I saw the messages. I know everything. David, the coward, tried to play it cool. Look, man, we didn't mean for it to. Before he could finish, I lunged at him, grabbing him by the shirt and slamming him against the wall. You didn't mean for what? To screw my wife? To lie to me? You think this is some kind of game? He looked scared now, like he hadn't expected me to actually confront him. His bravado crumbled under the pressure. Claire was screaming, "Stop! Please stop!" as she rushed over, grabbing my arm, trying to pull me off him. I was inches away from decking him, my fist raised, ready to lay him out, but Claire pulled harder, sobbing. Please, let's just go home. Please. Her voice was desperate, shaking with fear. I looked at her, my anger still red hot, but something about her tear-streaked face made me pause. She was guilty as hell, but even now, seeing her like that, I couldn't bring myself to cross that line. Not here, not in front of her, not yet. I let go of David, shoving him back against the wall one last time before stepping away. He stumbled, breathing hard, not daring to say another word. Claire grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the door, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, let's go. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But I let her pull me out of that house, the door slamming shut behind us as we walked out into the night. When we got home, the air was thick with tension, like everything was balancing on a knife's edge. I was still buzzing with adrenaline, my mind racing with the images of what I'd just seen, what I knew now. Claire was pacing around the living room, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself, but I could see the guilt written all over her face. She knew this was it. There was no more hiding. Just tell me everything, I said, my voice cold, distant. I didn't have the energy to be angry anymore. Not right then. I just needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. I never wanted it to be like this, she started, her voice trembling. It all started when I was helping Mr. Harrison with his interior design. I didn't say anything, just crossed my arms and stared at her, waiting for her to continue. At first, it was just work, she said, taking a deep breath. You know how much I admired him. He's everything you'd expect. Charming, sophisticated, powerful. I don't know when it changed, but we started talking more. It wasn't just about art anymore. We talk about life, about relationships, and, well, about us. I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm, but I could feel the heat rising in my chest. And where did that lead? I asked, my voice sharp. She looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. One day it just happened. We kissed. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't supposed to go any further. And it didn't. It was just one kiss, but it was enough to change everything. I stared at her, my heart pounding. Just a kiss? And that's when you decided to start sneaking around with his son? The words felt like poison on my tongue. Claire shook her head, her face crumbling. No, it wasn't like that. David saw us that day. He saw the kiss, and he started blackmailing me. The room went silent for a moment. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Blackmail? I repeated, trying to wrap my head around it. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. David's not like his father. He's troubled. He threatened to tell Mr. Harrison about the kiss, about what happened between us. He said he'd ruin me, ruin my work, ruin us. I didn't know what to do. I felt sick. So, what did you do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She wiped her face, her voice barely above a whisper now. I gave in. I thought I could keep it under control. I thought it would just be a way to stop him from telling anyone, to keep him quiet. But it got worse. Every time, he wanted more. He wanted to keep seeing me, keep pushing boundaries, and she paused, her breath hitching. I couldn't stop it. I stood there speechless, my mind spinning. It was too much, too insane to even process. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, had kissed a man twice her age, our neighbor, and had let herself be blackmailed into an affair with his son. And now you're saying you want him to get you pregnant? I asked, my voice shaking with disbelief and anger. Claire looked horrified, shaking her head quickly. No, I don't. That wasn't real. I said it because it's what he wanted to hear. I was trying to keep him happy, trying to keep him from telling anyone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like the entire foundation of my life had just been ripped out from under me. The woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with had gotten herself tangled up in something so absurd, so unbelievable, that I didn't even know where to begin. For a moment, the silence hung between us like a heavy weight. Then she spoke again, her voice breaking. I didn't know how to stop it, how to make it right. I didn't feel anything for David. I don't. It was all just a way to stop him from telling his father. But she paused, looking at me with a mixture of fear and guilt. I don't know how I feel about you anymore, either. That last line cut through me like a knife. I stood there, feeling like the ground beneath me had completely given way. This was too crazy to comprehend, too twisted to believe, but there it was, laid out in front of me like some sick confession. She didn't feel anything for me, and now I didn't know if I felt anything for her either. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know how to move forward. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. As Claire stood there, unraveling this insane confession in front of me, my mind started spinning, piecing together the events of the last few months. And then it hit me, August 15th, that day when she came home, nervous, jumpy, like something terrible had happened. The day I tried to ask her what was going on, but she brushed me off, saying it was just a stressful day with Mr. Harrison. Now, I knew exactly what had happened. That day, I muttered, my voice thick with realization. August 15th. That's when this all started, wasn't it? Claire's eyes widened. She looked down, biting her lip, confirming it without saying a word. That was the day you kissed him, wasn't it? That's when everything changed. She nodded, barely able to hold my gaze. Yes, that was the day. I had been working with Mr. Harrison for weeks by then, and we'd grown close. Too close. We spent hours talking, and I don't know when it crossed the line, but that day it did. It was the last day I worked for him. I thought I could end it there, after the kiss. I thought I could walk away. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the anger boiling inside me. But you didn't walk away, did you? Because David saw you. Her face crumpled with guilt. He saw us in the living room just after the kiss. He confronted me later, told me he would ruin everything if I didn't do what he wanted. And what he wanted was you, I said, the words bitter on my tongue. He used that kiss to blackmail you into being with him. Yes, she whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. At first, it was just his threats. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to lose everything, my work, my reputation, us. But David, he kept pushing. He wanted more. I thought I could control it, that I could manage it, but it spiraled. The more I tried to keep him happy, the more he dragged me in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So, while you were trying to fix your mistake with Mr. Harrison, you let his son, his 23-year-old son, blackmail you into some twisted affair? She nodded again, her tears falling freely now. I thought ending things with Mr. Harrison was enough. I thought I could leave it behind, but David became a bigger problem than I ever imagined. He kept pulling me in deeper and deeper, and I didn't know how to stop it. I stood there, stunned, as the full weight of her words sank in. That one kiss, just one moment of weakness, had unraveled everything. She had tried to cut it off with Mr. Harrison that day, but David's blackmail had dragged her into a nightmare she couldn't escape from. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the regret, but it didn't change the fact that she had let it go this far, that she had lied to me, betrayed me, and gotten herself trapped in a situation that had destroyed everything between us. Why didn't you just tell me? I asked, my voice low, exhausted. Why didn't you come to me when this started? She shook her head, her voice breaking. I was scared. I didn't know how. I thought I could handle it on my own, and I didn't want you to hate me. I let out a bitter laugh. Hate you? Claire, I don't even know who you are anymore. For a moment, the room was silent. The weight of everything that had been said hung between us, too heavy to lift. There was no going back now. That kiss that day, August 15th, had set everything in motion, and now it had all come crashing down. I had no idea what the next step was, but I knew one thing. Whatever we had, whatever I thought we were, was gone. The months after everything came crashing down were some of the hardest I've ever faced. The betrayal, the lies, the blackmail. It all swirled around in my head like a storm I couldn't escape from. I spent weeks, maybe months, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out how it had all gone so wrong. But the truth was no amount of thinking could fix what had been broken. The divorce was brutal, messy, drawn out, and painful in every way. Claire and I had built a life together, but it was all tangled up in that life we used to have, the house, the memories, the shared friends. It was impossible to separate it cleanly, so instead I tore it apart piece by piece. Every court hearing, every document signed, felt like another cut, another reminder of how far we had fallen. The love we once had, if you could even call it that now, was buried under layers of resentment, anger, and grief. But eventually, the divorce was finalized. I walked away from that chapter of my life, leaving behind the old house, the old neighborhood, and everything that reminded me of her. I couldn't stay there, not with the ghosts of what had happened haunting every corner. So I moved, far away, to a new house in a different part of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple, quiet place where I could start over. The first few weeks were strange, waking up in a new place in a bed that felt too big and too empty. But the quiet was nice. It was what I needed. Claire, from what I've heard through the grapevine, moved on too. She has her own life now, whatever that looks like. I didn't care to follow up or keep tabs on her. As far as I was concerned, I'd buried her in my head, and she could stay there, gone, forgotten, a part of my past that no longer had any hold on me. There was no point in dragging her memory into my present. She was out of my life for good. But the scars are still there, no doubt. There are days when the bitterness creeps in, and I wonder how I didn't see it coming, how I let things spiral out of control like that. Trust isn't something that comes easy to me anymore. Every woman I meet, every relationship I think about starting, there's this little voice in the back of my head asking, will she do the same thing? Will this happen again? I'm not naive. I know not every woman is Claire. Not every relationship is doomed to unravel the way ours did. But it's hard to shake that feeling, that lingering doubt. The truth is, I'm still trying to heal. I'm still working on believing that not every person I let into my life will betray me the way she did. I know it'll take time, but I also know that I can't let what Claire did define me forever. I won't let it. I've got a new house, a new life, and hopefully somewhere down the line, a fresh start with someone who actually values what we build together. Maybe one day, I'll trust again fully. Maybe one day I'll feel like myself again. Until then, I'll just keep moving forward one day at a time, trying to leave the past exactly where it belongs, buried.